Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today for the video game buyer's guide, we're talking about the 8-bit classic Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as the NES. Do not say that other word in my presence, I hate it. The NES was Nintendo's first home console, known as the Famicom in Japan. Now, I may or may not do a Japanese buyer's guide down the road for some of these consoles because the Japanese consoles are different enough from their North American counterparts. But for all intents and purposes, I'm focusing on what was available in North America. I don't know what was available in Europe. I know nothing about the European video game market. And what I know about Japan is going to basically be more than I can talk about in this video. Now, fortunately, the NES sold really well for the time. Worldwide, the NES plus Famicom sold about 62 million units, according to various internet sources, give or take. Um, Probably more units. Famicom probably sold better than NES, but the NES sold really well, even in the US, in Canada. So, um, I don't have to tell you about the NES like games. Obviously, you know the NES games. You've played them. You probably have some of them in some form or another. The NES is a classic. It's a great system. I love it. I miss it. I still play NES games to this day. It's a fantastic system. Who is the NES for? Now, in these videos, I like to decide who should who is the demographic for the NES today. Is it collectors? Is it NES? Is it Nintendo nerds? Is it retro gamers? Who is it? The NES is the first game console in this series that I'm going to classify as literally for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a retro gamer or a modern gamer or a completist or a Nintendo only gamer, whoever you are, if you play video games at all, you should play NES games, period. Um, Even if it's just the classics, either through emulation, via ROMs, or the Nintendo Switch Online, Virtual Console, etc., whatever. Fortunately, you've got options when it comes to NES. But there are some caveats. I do have to give you some warnings because the NES is not all sunshine and rainbows. So original hardware, let's talk about that first. The original Nintendo Entertainment System, as made available in North America, came in two flavors. The first one is the big gray box people refer to affectionately as the toaster. And then you have the top loader, which looks more similar to either the Famicom or the Super NES, respectively, depending on who you ask. It's basically the Famicom just modified for the US market, more or less. Um, but reminiscent to the Super Nintendo a little bit to, because, the Super Nintendo was brand new, but they still wanted to sell NES hardware because they were still selling NES software. Um, if you're going to buy original NES hardware, even though I have to put a caveat on the toaster, buy the toaster, do not buy the top loader. The top loader is basically a heartbreak waiting to happen. You don't want to mess with it. It's not worth it. They break down and they're not as easy to repair because the parts aren't as abundant because they didn't sell as well because they're more or less collector's items. So if you want to play NES games and you want to own original physical hardware, the toaster's the way to go. Um, for the most part. However, make sure when you buy a toaster, you get the one that says replacement 72 pin connector because the if you don't get one with a replacement connector, you're gonna have issues. Have you ever heard about the meme, the satanic rituals kids had to do to get their NES to work, blowing in the cartridge, tapping the top of the console, sticking two cartridges in at the same time, rubbing it with alcohol, etc., etc. Yes, these are real things because the connectors break because of the design of the system. I will say it's poorly designed. It is. They break, but they are easy to fix because they sold well and they're high in demand. So the parts are easier to get because there are aftermarket parts. So if you buy one, make sure you get one that has the refurbished pins. Make sure you ask or check the eBay listing or whatever. And if it doesn't, you're going to want to get the pins replaced from a reputable source. So do your research and find someone who can do that for you. Fortunately, if you want to collect NES cartridges, but you don't want to hassle with the finicky toaster and you don't want a chance replacing the pins or whatever, you have options. There are multiple, too many to list, retro clone machines that are compatible with the NES. Basically, NES is the benchmark, the baseline. Every retro clone starts with NES compatibility and goes from there. So they're pretty much all compatible with the NES. And they're more or less all going to be sufficient in their own ways. Not identical, some are better than others. You'll have to do your own research because I'm not going to pick sides in the retro clone battle. I'm just going to say, for all intents and purposes, they're all going to do the job, but some are better than others. So, you know, but for the most part, whichever one you buy should work. At least if all you care about is playing NES cartridges. Pretty much anyone will work. Now, you have another option, which is a semi official option. Nintendo themselves, a few years ago, released the NES Classic, also known as the NES Mini. Um, Now, this comes with 30 games pre installed, mostly good games. Games you're going to want to buy if you're collecting NES games. These are all games you're going to want to buy eventually, anyways, so it's a good place to start if you just want to play some games. Uh, Two things to note. First note, these things are expensive on the aftermarket because Nintendo didn't really expect it to sell well or didn't want to, for whatever reason, they didn't manufacture enough of them. So there's more demand than there is supply. So if you know how economics work, that means these motherfuckers cost a lot of money. So good luck getting your hands on one. But there's the other thing to note is actually there's two more things to note. They're easy to hack. So if you get one, you can load them up with ROMs. It's not that difficult. But also, there are some knockoff clones out there, so be careful. Don't overpay for a clone. Basically, a knockoff. Don't overpay for that. Now, emulation again. When computers got powerful enough to emulate older computers, the NES was the very first thing emulated. The very first thing anybody emulated was Super Mario Brothers on the NES. You know, arcade emulation was out there, but it was inconsistent and it was like all over the place. But there were like literally hundreds of NES emulators overnight. We still have dozens and dozens of them to this day. Again, I'm not going to pick an emulator and say, get this one over this other one. I will tell you, I use Virtua NES, but I also use a couple others, but I'm not going to say which ones they are because those are for special games that Virtua NES can't or doesn't emulate properly. But for the most part, I stick to Virtua NES because it's the best one, in my opinion. Or, well, for my needs. For my needs. Fortunately, unlike the previous two consoles in this series, you can also emulate the NES on other consoles. The original Xbox emulation scene is robust. The original Nintendo Wii, you can get emulators for the NES. I think you can for the Wii U, but don't mess with the Wii U. It's too expensive. It's not worth it. Not worth the hassle. Also, the PSP is another one you can emulate NES games on. The Game Boy Advance, the Nintendo DS are other ones. The Xbox 360 can emulate NES. There might be others, but for the most part, you can get. What I'm saying is, you can get NES games one way or the other. Now, you also have the option if you own a Nintendo Switch to pay a monthly subscription to the Nintendo Switch Online service, which gives you a fairly robust catalog of NES titles as well as titles from other retro Nintendo consoles. So that's another way to go if you're not that picky or you don't need to play every game. Now, as far as actual NES cartridges, you're going to have to do your homework. Not just on the cartridges themselves to know how to spot the bootlegs, but also what questions to ask a seller. One, to make sure they're reputable, and two, to make sure that they know their shit so that they're not ripping you off. Because they will take a random cartridge of, like, I don't know, Tetris or Duck Hunt or Clue Land, strip it for parts, stick a ROM chip in it, and put, a fake sticker on it and try to sell you um, something like uh, Big Nose the Dinosaur or uh, Flintstones Dinosaur Peak or one of the big expensive games, that are going to cost you a fortune. And they'll, the the game might regular price be $700 and they're selling it for $300 and you think that's a good price. Beware, they're still ripping you off. So you do need to do your research and your homework on NES cartridges if you go that route. Now, you can, if you're going to go with physical hardware, be it original or retro clones, you can also go the flash cart route. I do not recommend going this route because the flash carts on the NES are spotty at best. They're not good quality. Obviously, you also have things like the RetroPie is another possibility. So again, NES emulation is more or less the most robust and defined emulation scene of any emulator. You can pretty much emulate the NES on anything that is capable of emulating, just about, one way or another. It's the most robust, most developed, and most complete. You can get not only a complete NES library through emulation one way or the other, also you have ROM hacks, which is a fun world to explore, and you have retro NES titles that are new games made for the NES. So that still happens. An example would be Battle Kid, which I highly recommend if you're a fan of Mega Man games. It's a pretty rock solid Mega Man substitute. In some ways, better than actual Mega Man games on the NES, in my opinion. Because the only good Mega Man game on the NES, which I've already talked about, is Mega Man 2. Now, in these videos, I don't really do um, hidden gems or what games you should buy or whatever. But I do try to hit the highlights, like some of the games you're going to want to check out. And I try to give you a variety of games I know you've heard of, which you're going to be like, duh, everyone wants that game. And maybe a few like maybe you haven't heard of, or, you know, the consensus is it's not a great game, but I'm going to give you an alternative reason to, you know, not listen to the angry video game nerd. So obviously, anything made by Nintendo, all the first party games, the black box games, you're gonna want those. Most of your Capcom games, your Mega Mans, you're gonna want those. Your Konami games like Castlevania, Contra, you're gonna want those. Um, your Ninja Turtles, Star Wars, those are all good games. Um, Anything made by Hudson Soft is good. Anything, anything made by SNK is pretty good. Taito is pretty good. Um, you got some unlicensed stuff. So you got the Tengen games are all pretty good, but you also have officially licensed Atari and Namco games as well. So check those out. Those are pretty good. Um, some hidden gems. I've already talked about Xexies or XEXYZ on another video elsewhere. That's a good one. Um, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes is a good one. Gremlins 2, the new batch, is a good one. Um, I definitely recommend A Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. I think those are both fantastic. Um, I don't understand the hate they get. I just don't. And I think the Silver Surfer is a better game than people give it credit for. I think it's a pretty good game. Hard as fuck, but still a good game. And also, obviously you want Battletoads, Double Dragon, Batman. Those are all top-notch games. Obviously, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. Emulation for NES, you have options. You can use for controllers, you can go mouse and keyboard, which don't, but you could if you have no choice. You could also just use a modern controller, an Xbox or a PlayStation controller, hook it up via Bluetooth or USB, however you do. It's fine. It'll work. It'll get the job done. You have a couple options when it comes to authentic controllers. They do make aftermarket NES controllers that are identical to the original NES controllers, but they have USB ports instead of the NES ports. So you can buy those, or you can get adapters that have the NES plug on one end and a USB plug on the other end to hook your original authentic first party Nintendo controllers or original third party aftermarket controllers to your laptop or whatever via USB. So that's another route you can go. Or you can use the same concept. You could use a Super Nintendo controller, an N64 controller, a Genesis controller. There's so many options. Pretty much, and because the NES is just a D-pad and two buttons, so any controller will work. You know, obviously, if it doesn't have a button for select start, just map two random buttons on your keyboard, uh, enter or spacebar to differentiate. But most controllers are gonna have more than four buttons, so you should be good. Emula NES emulation is not that difficult. As far as processing power, pretty much any computer made after 1995 should be able to run NES ROMs. Um, but ideally, you want something from Windows XP or later, Pentium 3 or newer. That's ideally what you want. I can't really talk about mobile emulation because I don't know anything about it, but it's out there. It's an option if you want to go that route. But again, um, there's just so many ways to get access to NES games, um, whether the ROMs or the cartridges or whatever. So many ways. And for most people who get into retro gaming, the NES is your starting point, or at least one of the first, probably I would say, five consoles you're going to buy. Now, what I'm not going to do is tell you which games to avoid. The reason I'm not going to do that is because your experiences are going to be different than mine. Maybe there's a game I hated as a kid for whatever reason, but you loved it as a kid for whatever reason. And I'm not going to tell you this game sucks, don't play it, because you're going to be like, no, I love that game. Now, I'll do that with movies because, I'm going to give my opinion. But with video games, I do know nostalgia definitely plays a bigger role in video games than it does movies because video games are tactile and are interactive. They're more immersive. So you connect with the video game character and the world and the gameplay more than you do a movie. Movies are fairly passive. That's pretty much all there is to this. The NES is great. If you don't own one or have access to the ROMs through some means, be it official or otherwise, uh, check it out. Find a way to get access to the NES. It's definitely worth it, obviously. Um, it's one of the greatest video games of all time, game consoles of all time.